Well, a handful of U.S. military vessels departed from the U.S. East Coast last week en route to the coast of Gaza, where President Biden has ordered the construction of a temporary pier or port to deliver humanitarian aid. The president's plan, which was announced during his State of the Union address earlier this month, could involve more than 1,000 U.S. troops. Now, no boots on the ground. I guess they'll be walking on water. And it'll take about 2 months. And it's raised a lot of questions on both sides of the political aisle. Was this a hastily conceived political move by the president to regain support he lost over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war? And what could be the implications of this decision? Joining me now to discuss this is Frank Gaffney, the founder and executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Tony, thank you for having me.
So Frank, before we get into Biden's terrorist port, I want to touch on another topic you and I are concerned about, which is very relevant given the oral arguments today before the U.S. Supreme Court about government censoring the critics of their COVID-19 policies. Today, the World Health Organization's intergovernmental negotiating body met in Geneva, and the Secretary General, Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is pushing to make what the Biden administration did during COVID the norm, had this to say.
If we miss this opportunity, we risk losing momentum. More importantly, we risk leaving the world exposed to the same shortcomings that hampered the global response to COVID-19. A lack of coordination, a lack of sharing information, and a lack of equity.
Frank, you've been sounding the alarm over the World Health Organization and Dr. Tedros's power grab. Speak to that.
Well, Tony, as have you, and I'm very proud to be partnered with you in our sovereignty coalition, as we call it, which has exposed a lot of what's afoot here, as well as given people things to do about it. The short form of it is, as I think you've suggested, if you liked what the World Health Organization did in an advisory role during the pandemic of recent memory, you're going to love what it will be able to do when it can order you, compel you to do various things, among them being denied information about the best kind of medical treatment for whatever problem we may be facing at the time. All of this flows from the idea that somehow rewarding an agency that proved to be terribly corrupt and incompetent in that pandemic experience should be made more powerful, to the point where that gentleman that you were just hearing from, the Director General of the World Health Organization, will be the arbiter of when any nation in the world, including ours, has a public health emergency and what must be done about it. This is totally unconstitutional in our country, an affront to our sovereignty for sure, but also, Tony, a threat to your personal medical freedom. And it's unconscionable, right, and it must be stopped.
Yeah, and you look at the report, I was covering this earlier with Dr. Bhattacharya, the nonprofit Committee to Unleash Prosperity, and their report on the government's response to COVID, everything they got it wrong on. The same process is put into this global pandemic accord that's being pushed by the WHO. So, I mean, it's not like we have to guess will this work or not. We know it won't work. It'll simply trample upon the rights and freedoms of Americans and, of course, the 194 other nations that would be a part of this pandemic accord. I mean, this is not guesswork. We know where it's going.
Yeah, we've seen this movie, as you say, Tony. Here's the thing. What I believe most Americans don't fully appreciate yet is this is basically the product of what was called in the pandemic the China model. And the idea is that they're now going to make it possible for Tedros Ghebreyesus to impose that same China model on us at any time in the future. And what does that mean? That means the things like mask mandates, social distancing, lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations, including with inadequately tested, treatments of various kinds, and a digital gulag that will
Right.
essentially compel you to conform. Did anybody like that during the last exercise?
Yeah,
Heavens no.
exactly.
But they don't know that
Yeah.
this is going to be compelled upon them in the future.
Right, there'll be no question. It will be the standard operating procedure. But here's what people need to know. The only way to stop this is, we're calling on Congress to defund it, but with the slim majority, one-seat majority we have in the House, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen in this tranche of funding. This ultimately is going to come down to elections. This is the policies that we get from a leftist administration like the Biden administration. President Trump during his administration actually cut off the funding, pulled us out of the WHO, as they did cut off the funding to UNRWA. So elections have consequences.
Big time. And Tony, as you say, they will possibly mutate beyond recognition our nation in the interval between now and when this election takes place. So I think it's imperative, and we've got at the sovereigntycoalition.org website a vehicle for directly engaging with your elected representatives and telling them you want no part of this. You want us out of the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
But at a minimum, we need to stop paying for what it's going to do to us.
Yep, absolutely. Stop the funding and get out of there. All right, last week I was in Israel. We were communicating by text, and you sent a piece to me, some facts you put together on the port in Gaza, and I happen to be there right at the border of Gaza. And well thought out. I want you to explain to our viewers and our listeners that this is not just, humanitarian aid to Gaza. It sounds good. Oh, we're compassionate people. We want to help the people. But there's plenty of humanitarian support that's going in there. You've made that point clear. There's something more to this. Let's talk about it.
100%. Well, Tony, you suggested that maybe this was just sort of something lashed up on the spur of the moment to give the president something to talk about in light of the rebuke that he received from Muslim voters in Michigan. I think this has actually been a plan for quite some time, specifically of Samantha Power, who, as you know, is not only the U.S. Agency for International Development Director, but she's been a longtime activist in and out of government on behalf of the Palestinians. And she has as her purpose, as I believe does the administration more generally, to save Hamas. They're not really interested in having the Israelis succeed. They profess to be aligned with them and standing by them and supporting them and so on. But as you know, Tony, and I'm sure you saw it on the ground firsthand, what this administration has been doing has been inexorably creating more and more and more obstacles to the Israelis defeating Hamas decisively as they must. There is no other alternative other than losing their own country. But this idea of putting Americans on the ground in force with a port, and you're right, they won't be walking on water very long. They'll be walking on the ground. They'll be inserting themselves in the way between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And here's the thing, there's plenty of food there at the moment. It's just mostly being ripped off by who? By Hamas. It is keeping them a going concern, not least by selling this stuff. How's it going to change?
How's that going to change with the port?
I think it'll be made worse, because who knows what's going to be coming in through that port. As things stand now, the Israelis have some oversight of what is being shipped in. You start bringing it in from sea and they're not in the middle, it's going to go directly from whoever's providing it. Maybe it's the Chinese, maybe it's the Russians, maybe it's us, who knows, but that it will go into the hands directly of Hamas and further enable them to fight on.
But would that not then, when those issues come to the forefront, possibly draw the United States deeper into this, where they then have to be there at the port distributing and even putting themselves between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
I think that's the idea. That certainly has been Samantha Power's idea for decades. She's been talking about having the United States protecting the Palestinians against the Israelis. So yes, we will be in there. And Tony, as you understand, and I'm sure your audience does as well, The thing is, if Hamas survives all this, it's not just going to be a problem for Israel, it's a problem for us too. They're opposed to Judeo-Christian civilization. They're Sharia supremacists. They will seek our destruction just as surely as they seek that of Israel. They just have to get through the speed bump of Israel first. And the Biden administration is helping them get through that speed bump. It's that simple.
I want to go back, though, to how we may be positioning U.S. troops there in Gaza at this makeshift Biden port if power is correct or she's successful in what she's pushing for. We have history here. This is not something that is unprecedented. Back in the 80s, we nearly saw conflict, as you've pointed out in your briefing on this, between U.S. soldiers and IDF in Lebanon.
Well, there's that. And then there's the other example, Beirut, in which large numbers of American servicemen were murdered by Palestinian terrorists working with Iran. This is the kind of thing that I think you can absolutely predict will come about. And it may involve, conflict with the Israelis. But here's the really important takeaway from some recent polling, Tony. You might have seen some of it when you were on the ground there. The Israeli public overwhelmingly supports the defeat of Hamas decisively in Rafah, among other places, even if it produces a conflict with the United States. That's evidence of how determined they are and how clear-eyed the vast majority of Israelis are that they have no choice. They must win or they will be doomed. And they're right.
That's what I heard. I mean, I heard that from citizens. I heard that from government leaders. I heard that from the Prime Minister himself. They are resolute. Now, they would love to have America with them, but they're going without them because they know their future is on the line here. They're living in a neighborhood that's pretty rough. They don't have two seas on each side protecting them. They know that if they cannot fight to a draw, they have to fight to win, or else you're going to have every other bully in that neighborhood coming after them.
Yeah. And this, Tony, as you know, and I think it's important to say it explicitly, this is not just some notion of Bibi Netanyahu that is unsupported by the public, and if only they got rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, which the Biden administration is explicitly seeking to do. Not just Chuck Schumer, by the way, but the administration itself. They will not find the public is opposed to him. They will be supporting him. And that's because of this very clear recognition of the unfortunate reality. You put a Palestinian state on the ground there, there was one in Gaza, for that matter, you will see Israel destroyed. In fact, I heard the other day that had there been a Palestinian state on October 7th, Israel would not have survived it. We mustn't let that happen again.
Yeah, if they have a state, they then can have an army. Then they can have all of the military support that an army would have. They didn't have that, and look what they did. Just think of what they would have if they had the military of a standing state.
Yeah, well, and we've been trying to give them in the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria, to the Palestinian Authority, a pretty substantial army. It's not fully capable, but it's got a lot of weapons that are capable of doing an October 7th to the people in those settlements on the West Bank.
And we've been training
what they did in October 7th at any time. We have been training them too. You're absolutely right. Yeah. That's a nightmare.
Frank Gaffney, appreciate you joining us. Appreciate the work you do at the Center for Security Policy.